Hello, everybody, and welcome. I see our attendees numbers are starting to level off, so we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rachel Vincent, and on behalf of the National Park Service and Boston Harbor Now, we all want to welcome you to our annual lecture series, Revolutionary Harbor. Thank you so much for joining us for the second in our three-part series, Signs of Spring. Temperatures are starting to rise, days are getting longer, and as spring begins to emerge for all of us, we'll hear from two local experts about the ways in which the changing seasons impact urban wildlife in areas like Boston Harbor and its islands. A few housekeeping notes before we dive in. Please know that this presentation is being recorded. There are closed captions available for this presentation. If you scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can see the CC button, and you can click on that to turn closed captions on or off. We're going to save questions until the very end of our presenters, but please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window throughout the presentation as it happens, and we will answer them at the end. Lastly, we would love for everyone to tell us where they are virtually visiting from. So on the bottom of your Zoom screen, the other button down there is the chat feature. So please feel free to drop your city and state into the chat. Again, the questions you can put in the Q&A window, but feel free to let us know where you're coming from in the chat box. So I am very excited to welcome our first presenter, Teá Kesting-Handly, a third-year PhD student at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the founder of the New England Entomological Society. She'll walk us through what spring means for Sphingidae, which are Hawkmoths and Sphinx Moths, in urban landscapes, including the diversity and ecology of Sphingidae in urban areas. We'll learn how they're able to survive the winter, what cues they require in spring, and some of the ways that they differ from butterflies. Teá, the time is now yours.
Thank you very much, Rachel. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Teá Kesting-Handly. I am a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, working with Dr. Robert Stevenson. My work focuses on Sphingiday ecology, including research into which species can survive in urban areas. Tonight, I will be speaking broadly about Sphingidae and giving some background on what they are, and then we'll discuss how they survive in urban areas, what species fly during different parts of the year, and how they react to spring. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about what these organisms are. So what are Sphingidae? Sphingidae are commonly called the Hawkmoths or Sphinx Moths. The common name of hawkmoth comes from their ability to fly strongly and for long distances. The common name of Sphinx moth comes from the resting position of many of their caterpillars, which sit similarly to an Egyptian sphinx. There are approximately 1,300 species of Sphingidae in the world, found on every continent except Antarctica, and more are being discovered daily. Many Sphingidae are important pollinators, and some are actually the sole pollinators of certain plants. Their larvae usually have a caudal horn, which is this thing right down here, located at the back of the larva. And not all species have this, and some will actually lose it as the caterpillar grows. Before we discuss the biology of these organisms, it's important to understand the life cycle. Pictured here is the complete life cycle from egg to adult of Eumorpha fasciatus, or the banded sphinx. The eggs, pictured here, are laid singly and are green and are quite large for Lepidoptera eggs. So they're a couple of millimeters in diameter. The larva hatches from this egg and goes through 5 different instars or molts, which is how it grows. For many species, the larva is able to change its pattern or coloration through these molts. And so here's the first instar, second, third, fourth, and finally the 5th. Once the larva is full grown, it digs itself underground to pupate. Most species of Sphingidae pupate underground, though a couple do pupate in a loosely spun silken cocoon, and a few others pupate in leaf litter. This is an example pupa of the Sphingidae right here. After sufficient time has passed, approximately 2 weeks or up to 8 months in some cases, the adult moth will emerge from the pupa. Sphingidae larvae, or often called hornworms, are really, really awesome and primarily what I study. So because these caterpillars are often known as hornworms, it's a bit of a misnomer, as many species lack a caudal horn or actually will lose it during development. To make matters more confusing, these horns are able to break off if attacked by a predator. Sphingidae larvae are easily determined by their large size, presence of a caudal horn or a fake eye spot at the end of the larva, and by their distinctive resting position. Many species are phenotypically variable, being able to change their coloration or pattern based upon different environmental or genetic factors. This is especially evident in the Eumorpha species, as some of their larvae can have up to 8 different color morphs. All Sphingidae are herbivorous, eating the leaves of plants, primarily vines, shrubs, and trees. This is actually an important distinction to make, as there are indeed carnivorous Lepidoptera caterpillars. So pupa, chrysalids, and cocoons are actually all terms for the same thing. They're all terms for the pupal stage of Lepidoptera. Specifically, a chrysalis is the term for a butterfly pupa, though pupa is also correct and arguably more technically correct. A cocoon, on the other hand, is specific to many species of moths and is a silken cover that surrounds the pupa. So here we have a chrysalis and here we have a cocoon. These distinctions may seem strange, but they are important. For example, many of our Saturniidae, or the giant silk moths, pupate within a cocoon. This adds an extra layer of insulation for the pupa to get through the winter, as these moths tend to pupate above ground, usually in trees or leaf litter, and as such are exposed to the elements. For species that burrow underground, like Sphingidae, it is usually a bare pupa with no covering, which you can see here. Additionally, many Sphingidae pupae have these really awesome proboscis capsules here. And so this is one of Agrias cingulata that actually bends around, but many others will have sort of a straight line here to show the proboscis. So Massachusetts is home to about 49 species of these moths. This includes 37 resident species, which means they regularly breed in the state and don't die back each year. Several out of these species have not been seen in decades, and as it's very likely that they're extirpated in the state. And on this slide are just a few examples of some of our Sphingidae that you can find in Massachusetts. In Boston, there are 23 species of Sphingidae, well, recorded from Suffolk County, which also includes revered Chelsea and Winthrop. Out of these species, many are fairly common, but a handful are much rarer and are quite unusual to be found in such urban environments. All of our Lepidoptera that live in Massachusetts are well adapted to surviving our winters. They all have a different strategy for getting through the winter. Some rely on being pupae underground or above ground and being dormant until they are cued into emergence. And other species overwinter as eggs, and some still even overwinter as adults. All of our Sphingidae overwinter as pupae underground. Some of our very common species of Arctiinae, or tiger moth, overwinter as larvae. The most common is Pyarctia isabella, or the woolly bear moth, which is this guy down here. Interestingly enough, most of our hairstreak butterflies overwinter as eggs laid on their host plants, which are then ready for leaf emergence in the spring. We also have some butterfly species that will overwinter as adults, like this morning cloak butterfly. Why do we see these differences? Well, it really depends on when the species is active. If adults are active in midsummer, it makes much more sense to overwinter as a pupa. If larvae are adapted to only eating new leaves, you might find those species tend to overwinter as eggs, so that their larvae are first to the leaf buffet in early spring. And additionally, like I just mentioned with the morning cloak, some of our adult Lepidoptera do overwinter as adults, and they can overwinter under bark or in the eaves of houses or in wood piles. and they're actually active out on warm winter days. So how do we define spring? This is actually a more complicated question than you might imagine. So for humans, spring officially begins on the equinox in March, but for insects, spring can start at different times. Our earliest emerging Lepidoptera tend to start emerging and flying in mid to late March, whereas others emerge much later. Generally, Sphingidae do not start flying until late April or early May, though peak diversity is much later in mid-July. One way we can measure spring is by using something called growing degree days, or GDDs. And this system takes into account daily temperatures and is a good indicator of when crops will start to emerge, which also coincidentally works very well for Lepidoptera. You can essentially calculate the number of days above or below the average temperature of the region, and then accurately estimate when these organisms will start emerging. What triggers emergence for Lepidoptera? This is, again, a very complicated question with no one right answer. Most species use a combination of cues, including light, heat, and rainfall, but it's incredibly climate dependent. For example, in Arizona, moths are triggered to emerge by the arrival of the monsoon season. Without adequate moisture, they will actually continue to overwinter occasionally for 2 or 3 years until the conditions are perfect for them to emerge. In Massachusetts, light and heat are our most important indicators, though rainfall also triggers emergence for many of our summer species. If the season is too dry, species may overwinter for yet another year. If our springs are very cool, many of our Lepidoptera that are active in early spring will not emerge on time and instead sync up with later emerging species when conditions are better. Sphingidae are active throughout the growing season, usually with the first species emerging in late April or early May. The highest diversity of Sphingidae can be found in mid to late July. The flight season usually ends in September, or some years in early October, with only 2 or so species being active as adults at that time. There are many more species active as larvae during the fall. The graph on this slide depicts diversity of Sphingidae throughout the season. This data is actually part of a multi-year study and was collected by myself during my surveying of Sphingidae in urban, suburban, and rural areas. This is a combination of 2019 and 2020 data. I don't actually expect to add many more species to my survey in the next 3 years, but it is possible. So far, I've recorded 28 species of Sphingidae during my survey. As you can see on this graph, we have very low diversity of Sphingidae in May. Only a couple of species are out then. And it gradually peaks up until in July, and then it starts to decrease. And in September, most of the species recorded here are larvae rather than adults. So as we just covered, the emergence of Lepidoptera is tricky. For Sphingidae, most of our species are active in midsummer. Some species only fly during one season, which means they may only have 1 generation per year. This is often because they need a significant amount of time to develop as larvae. Many species of Saturniidae, or the giant silk moths, follow this pattern as well, flying in June, and that's about it. Their larvae will take all summer to pupate, and then they will overwinter. For Sphingidae, we have species that are active in multiple seasons, or just one sometimes. This is because these moths are able to develop quickly as larvae and therefore can have multiple generations, helping to bolster their population size. Additionally, some species exhibit what we call delayed emergence, where from the same batch of pupae, some will hatch in early June, and then the rest in July or August. This helps these species have multiple broods throughout the year without having to have multiple generations. There are some species that are active throughout the growing season, either because of delayed emergence or because they're able to grow quickly enough as larvae to have a 2nd or 3rd generation. A good example of this is Durapsicoerilus, the azalea sphinx, which is active from May to August as an adult and into October as a larva. Some species of Sphingidae are more adapted to the cold and have one generation in the early spring and then again in early fall. Hyley's galli, the gallium sphinx, is a great example of this, as the adults are active in May and then again in September. Lastly, we have something called vagrant species. In Massachusetts, we have 12 species that fit this definition. These are species that are not actively breeding in the state, but fly up from southern populations in late summer and early fall. These species can often be found at light traps, whether that be a gas station, a Walmart, or an actual light trap in the fall season, and are really spectacular and quite a treat to see. They do generally show up each year, but where and when is impossible to predict. So pictured here are a few species of our earliest flying Sphingidae. We have Sphingidae abbotti, or the abbot sphinx, which is usually the second or third species to emerge in Massachusetts, often flying in early May. Didamia inscriptum, this guy right here, the lettered sphinx, is often the first species that flies in late April. Next, we have two species of sphinx. One is a species complex containing Sphinx gordius and Sphinx pusilla, the apple sphinx. And the second is Sphinx drupiferarum, the wild cherry sphinx. These species begin flying in May and continue through June and July in some cases. Additionally, we have Smerinthus jamaicensis, which has two flight periods, one in May and one in July. Summer is the most productive season for Sphingidae, with the bulk of our species emerging and flying then. Pictured here are just a few representative species that tend to fly in June through July. We have some really spectacular species here, and many of these have actually been recorded from Boston. However, most interesting on this slide is this last species here. This is Manduca jasminiarum, also known as the ash sphinx. And this moth actually disappeared completely from Massachusetts from about 2003 to 2017. There are virtually no records from then. In 2017, it did start making a reoccurrence and has slowly been expanding its range back across the state. As I mentioned before, there are some species that are still active in the fall. Hyley's galli, the gallium sphinx, which is this moth right here, and Hyley's lineata, the white-lined sphinx, which is this species here, are most frequently encountered in the fall, actually in September, when with their larvae sometimes lingering into November. So these are very late flying species. Pictured here are just a few examples of things that prey on Sphingidae larvae or use them as a host for their developing offspring. Broadly speaking, there are tachinid flies and broconid wasps that use Sphingidae larvae as hosts. This is called parasitism, as the host larva is killed by these species. And I'll talk more about this in just a moment. Additionally, bats, birds, and other insects are all huge predators of Sphingidae and will devour both adults and larvae, whichever they can catch. As I briefly mentioned, Sphingidae larvae are host to many species of parasitoids. The most common one to find in Massachusetts is the tachinid fly Compsoglyra coccinata. This was an introduced fly used to control Lymantria dispar populations. Unfortunately, it found that Lymantria dispar larvae were too hairy and less appealing than our usually smooth and larger Saturniid and Sphingid species. The second most common parasitoid is Cotesia congregata, which is a broconid wasp. The images on this slide are actually all of the same caterpillar, a Sphinx gordius or pusilla I found in a power line cut in Berkshire County, Massachusetts. This caterpillar is quite unlucky. It has both the eggs of a tachinid fly, which are these little white specks all along the side and up here, and also the emerging larvae of a broconid wasp, which are these larvae up here. And so these larger holes on the back of the caterpillar are where these wasp larvae crawled out of. And as you can see in this picture here, they're starting to spin their cocoons, which is what they will, with the adult wasp, will eventually emerge out of. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the struggles of urban environments to organisms. As you can probably imagine, there are many difficulties to living within an urban environment. There are many papers on this subject, so I'm just going to briefly summarize the main issues here. The first is increased risk of predation or parasitism. This is a very interesting phenomenon, as because urban areas are often small, many of these predators and parasitoids have an easier time finding the handful of larvae that may exist in a given area. Conversely, because strands of host plant are usually not super large in these urban areas, as long as eggs aren't laid too densely, there is a good chance the larvae are able to hide easier from these predators. That being said, there is ample data to show that predation and parasitism rise dramatically in urban areas. Next, we have ALAN, or artificial light at night. And this is a huge driver of insect decline across the board. This cannot be stated enough. Light pollution is extremely detrimental to insect populations. The figure on this slide is from a paper, Owens et al. 2020, where they outlined the reasons ALAN is bad. Briefly, ALAN disrupts mating, increases predation, and disrupts behaviors like feeding, among many other issues with it. Habitat destruction and alteration is another major issue in cities. Wherever habitat is destroyed, countless organisms go along with it. In urban areas, this is especially true, as there may not be another refuge for these organisms to move to. Heat sinks are another issue to living in urban areas. Urban areas are much hotter than their surroundings, which can mean that species living there emerge earlier, sometimes poorly timed with their host plant availability. Additionally, it means that these species that rely on cooler temperatures may not be able to survive in urban areas at all. In urban areas, there's also a significantly higher degree of competition between non-native organisms, which usually thrive in these areas. Roads and traffic are another major driver of insect decline. Roadways in the areas surrounding them are often sprayed with pesticide and herbicide to keep them clear, and this is extremely detrimental to insect life. Additionally, crossing a road is perilous, even for flying insects. And lastly, many aquatic insects are negatively impacted by roads, as they think these are bodies of water and attempt to lay eggs on them. Another major concern is the lack of connective habitat in urban areas. Boston is actually very nice on this front. There's quite a bit of green space, and it does seem to be interconnected. But in other areas, there are just isolated chunks of habitat with no connections between them. This makes it very difficult for insects to disperse, often leaving them trapped on these urban islands. There are definitely some pros to living in an urban environment, especially if the species in question is able to adapt to the cons I just mentioned. Interestingly, the use of native plant species in urban plantings and yards have helped many species of Lepidoptera, including some Sphingidae, recolonize these areas. The numerous Fraxinus or ash species located in the Boston Common is sometimes home to Sphinx chersis, the greater ash sphinx, which is a fairly uncommon species. It was last seen in 2017 in Boston. Usually the species is much more common to the west of the city and is not one that many people consider to be an urban dweller. Urban heat traps can also benefit some species, though it may hurt others. By trapping heat, species that require more heat to develop can thrive, and in some cases reproduce faster and have more generations per year. They're also helped by the lingering heat into the fall. Green spaces within cities are important niches that can be exploited by Sphingidae. As I mentioned before, the inclusion of native plants in these areas is vastly important. Connecting habitat in urban areas can also be a safe haven for many species. Even small patches can harbor rare or uncommon species. The map on the bottom of this slide shows the Emerald Necklace, which runs from downtown Boston to Jamaica Plain, and this is a great example of connective habitat. Lastly, urban environments can sometimes harbor species that may not be found elsewhere. This is true for native and non-native species. So this is a graph also from my research into Sphingidae in urban areas. The premise of this study is to examine 14 sites across Massachusetts and an additional 3 in Florida to determine what species of Sphingidae are found in urban, rural, or suburban areas. I do this by light trapping and also by using a UV flashlight to survey for larvae. By targeting both adults and larvae in my surveys, I get a much better picture of what species are located in these different areas. So this graph is a species accumulation curve. where the blue line represents the number of species found in rural areas, red in suburban areas, and yellow in urban areas. There are some very interesting trends. As you can see that suburban and rural sites are fairly close in terms of the number of species, with rural being the most speciose. Interestingly, urban areas are significantly lower and really don't come close to the other two lines at all. And the images on the left of this slide are just a few samples of moths found during this study. So lastly, I wanted to touch a little bit about sort of restoration of habitat and using native plants, and how to encourage these organisms as well as other insects to thrive in urban areas. Sphingidae in particular are able to thrive in areas that are in a number of habitats and areas, and this is due to their larval habits and their incredible dispersal habits as adults. In urban areas that have lots of native plants, many species of Sphingidae are able to thrive there. A great example is Eumorpha pandoris, or the Pandora Sphinx, which was seen in the state fairly regularly, but recently became heavily established in cities like Boston and Worcester, using planted Parthenocissus quinquifolia as well as planted Vitis. Habitat restoration with a focus on using native plants is key to helping to restore urban areas into ecological oases. At UMass Boston, our campus contains a ton of restored habitat with native plants, and because of that, there are lots of native species of insect that thrive on campus. This includes species of hawkmoth. I have found both Manduca sexta, the tobacco hornworm, and Hyles lineata, the white-lined sphinx, on campus, which is pretty neat. And lastly, native plants support the highest percentage of Lepidoptera species. While some are able to adapt to non-native species, planting native plants is the best way to conserve these species in urban environments. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Teá. So again, as a reminder, feel free to drop any questions you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I wrote down a couple of questions also, but one really great one that came in is, how is climate change affecting the life cycle of these Lepidoptera and Sphingidae, or does it?
That's a great question. So climate change is definitely impacting these organisms. The way in which it is doing so is a little bit harder to define. Because our summers tend to be a little bit hotter now, some of these organisms are actually able to have more generations per year, which is beneficial to them as it helps raise their population. But the other sort of ways that climate change can affect these organisms is still a bit unclear, and a lot more research needs to be done.
Awesome, thank you. I know that's definitely a pressing question that I think are on a lot of people's minds. One great question: how can pupas tell if it's raining? You mentioned the number of rain days, the amount of rain and sunlight and things like that. So how do they know?
Definitely. So it's the condition of the soil that they're in. So once it rains heavily, the soil becomes a lot more wet and saturated, and the water tends to travel downward. And that is sort of how they're cued into it, the rain.
Awesome, thank you. So one question that I had is, are there any non-native or invasive species of Lepidoptera or Sphingidae specifically in our area?
There are quite a few non-native species of Lepidoptera in our area. I think it would probably take me another 30 minutes to go through the whole list. So yes, there are definitely quite a few. For Sphingidae, actually, we do not have any non-native species in Massachusetts. There is one introduced species into the Midwest that was used as biocontrol for leafy spurge. It's Hyles euphorbiae, or the spurge hawkmoth. And so that is our only introduced hawkmoth species as far as I'm aware.
Awesome. And related, we had a question how do you decide what kind of species to help, i.e. not supporting invasive or particularly aggressive species? Not sure if that's focused on specifically plants or Lepidoptera or Sphingidae directly, but feel free to talk about either side of that.
Sure. I'm sorry, would you mind just repeating that question? I cut out.
Sure. So how do you decide what species to help, i.e. not supporting invasives or particularly aggressive species? When I read that, I think of especially the plant species that you were talking about that that these Lepidoptera might need and Sphingidae might need for their own pollination and food and things.
Absolutely. So in terms of plants, native plants are easily the way to go. Planting non-natives or even native cultivars is just not quite as beneficial to these organisms as native plants. As for trying to, or which species of Lepidoptera to help, or even just Sphingidae, it can never hurt to help them all. If you're helping one, you're usually helping many, and that's primarily by planting these native plants. Unfortunately, a lot of our introduced species are generalist, and so by planting native plants, you might inadvertently be helping them a little bit as well, but you're doing far more help for our native species than anything else.
Awesome, thank you. We had a question about the gypsy moth. Are they related, or how related are they? They must be related in some way. So how related? Woolly bear caterpillars look a little similar.
Yes, so they are in a different family. Their family is Erebidae, which are the owlet moths. So I'm trying to remember the entire Lepidoptera phylogeny offhand right now. I believe they are fairly closely related, but not super closely related. They're in different super families as well. So they're sort of like distant cousins, I guess we can say.
Awesome. A question kind of relating back to what we asked earlier about recognizing rain and in the soil. So how do they recognize, the pupa recognize daylight and heat, and what are those specific cues that they're getting to emerge in the spring?
Absolutely. So heat is sensed by the underground pupators by the soil temperatures warming. So the more heat we get, the warmer the soil becomes and the more they experience that. For pupae above ground, or, particularly butterflies or some of our giant silk moths, they are directly exposed to the elements, and so they can actually feel the sunlight and feel the heat, which is why most of those species tend to emerge earlier in the year.
Awesome, thank you. What is the average range of some of these species? I know that you were mentioning that some are in Massachusetts year-round and that some travel. So what is the range for some of those that are either here or are they traveling? How far are some of them traveling?
So all of the species we have in Massachusetts can also be found pretty much everywhere else along the East Coast. As for our vagrant species, those are primarily southeastern US species that wander up the coast in the fall. We do have quite a few species that are just not occurring in Massachusetts. They're either more western species or much more southern species. Our cold climate sort of impacts a lot of what we can have.
Definitely. Awesome. So going back to the first question that we had about climate change potentially impacting the Sphingidae directly, do we have, what kind of evidence might we have in terms of climate change impacting the predators of these species? Is that more clear, or is that still kind of, we know a little bit, but not sure the direct impacts?
I think it's a lot more of the second, unfortunately. We don't have a lot of details on this, especially for insect predators. Insect populations themselves vary so much from year to year that it's impossible to say if a species is actually declining just from looking at 1 year worth of data. And so because of that, insect predators also kind of influx and diminish after certain cycles of these insect population booms. So it is very hard to say, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure we'll know after it happens, unfortunately. Can you speak at all about emerald ash borer and the loss of ash trees. Do you know if that is kind of a food source? Is that impacting sphinx moth populations?
Yeah, absolutely. So emerald ash borer is definitely a big problem. They are taking down our ash trees at an alarmingly fast rate. For those of you who don't know, emerald ash borer is a wood-boring beetle that bores under the bark of ash trees and eventually kills them. We do have many species of Sphingidae that feed exclusively on ash or on the family Oleaceae. And it has been shown that in the Northeast, these species are declining pretty rapidly, in fact, as we lose our ash forests. Some of them are able to adapt to other non-native food sources like lilac and privet, although there's some evidence showing that these might not be very nutritious host plants for these organisms.
Thank you so much. Couple more. Again, feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Does mothing at night and using UV lights contribute to ALAN? And can you remind us the acronym of ALAN? Because I remember it, but not the word for word.
ALAN is artificial light at night. And the short answer is yes. Any sort of nocturnal light outside is going to be problematic for insect populations. All of the light traps I use are specifically designed to attract insects and are essentially the only way we can do these sorts of studies. So it's a bit of a trade-off. You are definitely disrupting the insect population that night that you're there, but I try to space out my visits to about once every 2 weeks, so I'm not totally overwhelming anything going on there.
Awesome, thank you. How long does an individual live? I know that you mentioned multiple generations in a year, and also that if the conditions aren't right, they might overwinter for another season. So how long might one individual live?
So that is a great question and a bit complicated to answer. So one individual can live, including its larval and pupal stage, for up to a year and a half, I would say. Larvae generally are around for anywhere between 1 month and 4 months. Pupae are around anywhere from 2 weeks to 8 months, and adults usually live about 2 to 4 weeks.
Awesome. So someone said that they noticed a tomato hornworm on one of their tomato plants and removed it. Another person I know who's on this call had said that they don't love hornworms because they're constantly eating their tomato plants. So do sphinx moth larvae dine on tomatoes and other food crops? And what are some of the common native plants that they can plant? So kind of a two-part question. So food crops, how are those related? And then separately, what are some native plants that we might be able to plant to help Sphingidae?
So yes, there are a couple of species that eat tomato and other solanaceous crops. Manduca sexta, the tobacco hornworm, and Manduca quinquemaculatus, the tomato hornworm. Both of those will eat tomato. Manduca sexta is significantly more common in the state. If you do find them on your tomatoes, you can actually move them to any other sort of native solanaceous plant or even non-native solanaceous plant, like datura. They love datura. They also love bittersweet nightshade, which is a very common weed. And I always tell everyone to put all of their Manduca species on their tomatoes on those plants because it does two good things. It gets rid of an invasive weed and it helps a native organism. As for plants that you can plant to bring or attract Sphingidae, it varies dramatically. There are so many different species that eat so many different things. I can't really state if you plant these 4 plants, you'll have a great time. That being said, anything in the Vitis family, so Parthenocissus quinquefolia, Virginia creeper, or even grape species. Many species of Sphingidae love those, and so that's a good way to attract them. Additionally, viburnum, cherries, birch, and quite a few other trees. So there's a varied host plant list there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Teá. In the interest of time, we are going to move on to our next presenter. I know that there's a couple more questions in the chat. in the Q&A box. Teá, if you are willing to type in an answer there, great. If not, that's totally fine too, and we can get those answers out to you later on. So thank you, Teá, for the wonderful presentation. We are now going to introduce Wayne Peterson. So Wayne Peterson is the director of the Massachusetts Important Bird Area Program with Mass Audubon. Tonight, Wayne will draw from his extensive experience researching, protecting, and presenting on birds of New England and discuss ways in which migratory birds impact landscapes, how they interact with landscapes, especially places like the Boston Harbor Islands in early spring. Things he might talk about include nesting activities, destinations of migratory species, and the remarkable ways in which they accomplish their epic seasonal journeys. So Wayne, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away. Looks perfect, Wayne. We can see it great.
All right, can you hear me all right?
You sound great, and the presentation looks great. It's all yours.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, and thank you, Teá. That was really a spectacular presentation. I have to say, I learned a lot from that. And while admittedly moths can fly, I think it's fair to say that birds can fly better, and they can fly further. And to that extent, and to that end, much of what I'm going to say in the next few minutes is really focused on migration, because migration is such a powerful phenomenon for this time of the year. And in spring, whether it be the Boston Harbor Islands or anywhere in urban Boston or statewide, migration is a phenomenon. And every year at this season, literally millions of feathered travelers are making their way northward. So that's kind of a hard thing to get your head around, but in fact, it's true. So in thinking about spring migration and birds, I'm not going to focus on any one species or any group of species, but I just want you to get some sense of how many different groups of birds, in fact, are migratory. Not to say that all of them in each of these families is necessarily a migrant, but a great many of them are. And you know, on the left, all of them are water birds, and on the right, they're land birds and passerines and things. So it's quite a full cast of characters in terms of the species that are travelers in effect. This is sort of an over-the-top view of the Western Hemisphere, but I think it serves to illustrate the point I was making, that not just in Massachusetts and New England are there lots of migratory birds, but there are huge numbers of migrants moving north and south from one continent to the other, from South America to North America. And if we were to sort of imagine flipping this around and looking at Africa and Eurasia and Europe, the same sort of thing. So just huge numbers of birds traveling and migrating all the time, which obviously raises a lot of potentially interesting questions in terms of you know, how they do it and some of the aspects of what migration is all about. The seasons of migration vary from group to group and species to species. Not all groups are necessarily migrating in the same way or at the same time, although there is a certain predictability as far as the timing of many migrants. And this is one of the things that makes spring migration particularly pleasing to people who sort of track such things, because oftentimes we can anticipate when certain birds are going to show up. By golly, there they are. So for things like Baltimore Orioles, let's just take May 5th. By golly, come May 5, in most years, if you sort of wander around a wooded neighborhood or you know, a city park or a nice planted cemetery like Mount Auburn in Cambridge or something, pretty good chance you're going to see and or hear Baltimore orioles that have just arrived from the tropics, and their numbers will increase over the course of the month of May. They'll reach a peak, and then the ones that are going to travel further north will eventually have left the state, and you're left with the breeders. The fox sparrow on the right here, we're almost right in the wheelhouse of fox sparrow migration. This is a very early migrant relative to the oriole, and it's also a migrant that has a very precise time window, not only when they come, but they don't stay here very long, and they're not all that common in many areas. So in some cases, the migration is very precise. In some cases, like the fox sparrow, it's quite rapid. And in both cases of these two, it's pretty well timed. Others like raptors, these are broadwing hawks on the left, and shorebirds, mostly short-billed dowitchers and red knots and things in the picture on the right. They tend to come and go more gradually so that their migration period is sort of stretched out. I selected these two images not because they're necessarily completely characteristic of how they appear in Massachusetts, but for the broadwing hawk on the left, unlike some other raptors, they tend to have these very explosive migrations, especially in the fall, so that oftentimes a major percentage of the eastern Canadian and northern New England population of broadwings may pass through the Commonwealth within a matter of about a week or so, week or 10 days. Shorebirds, on the other hand, which are really long distance migrants that are coming from Arctic areas, many of them headed for areas in South America, in some cases as far south as Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego and the extreme southern parts of the continent. Their migration may stretch out from early July until the end of October and even into early November, depending upon the species involved. So it's a much more gradual migration for them. But in the spring, everybody wants to get back to home ground and begin to start nesting and so forth. So these kinds of numbers that these two pictures illustrate are somewhat atypical of what we'd normally expect in terms of migration for either raptors or shorebirds. But eventually the ones that everybody who's really seriously interested in birds, or the ones that get people seriously interested in birds, warblers, come along. And again, you know, we have about 30 some odd species, and so different species do things in different ways. But the bottom line is that what they are essentially timing their arrival through Massachusetts, whether it be stopping at the Harbor Islands or Western Massachusetts and the Berkshires, they're waiting for the emergence of all things, caterpillars, not necessarily Sphingid caterpillars, because in many cases, those are a little too big for birds the size of warblers, which are pretty small. But the emergence of caterpillars from all kinds of moths and in some cases butterflies is one of the things that's a major food source for these birds during spring migration and in the early part of their breeding season when they're looking for protein to feed to their babies. If you don't recognize these four species, the one in the upper left is a black-throated green warbler, and the one underneath it is a chestnut-sided warbler, pretty well named. And the one in the upper right-hand corner is a black-throated blue warbler, also pretty well named. And the one under that is a Nashville warbler, not so much. But a lot of warbler species and a lot of bird species, in fact, derive names from when they were first discovered and described, and those names have held over, so they're not always that appropriate in terms of what the birds may look like. The question that we should be asking right about now, early in this presentation, is why do birds migrate? And if you wind the clock back far enough, certainly ancestrally, it was, and in fact, it still is to a large extent, to reduce competition for resources in the face of changing climate. And as we variously talk about climate change here, this is one of those things that ultimately is going to probably be a factor in affecting the abundance of many of these bird species going forward. They also are attempting to retreat from unseasonable temperatures. So again, there were glacial periods and there were interglacial periods. over long spans of geologic time, and the climate was considerably different during these various periods. Needless to say, we're coming into a warming period now, which is one of the things that is affecting bird migration and various other organisms in a host of ways. They're obviously retreating from unseasonable temperatures to exploit food resources that are only seasonally available to them in the warmer weather, which is why the vast majority of North American and temperate zone migrants go from north to south during the fall and into the winter. Some species are unable to alter their diet, but these are mainly insectivores like flycatchers, swallows, a lot of the warblers. But there are other species, for example, like American robins, which are easily able to switch from eating worms and insects in the warmer weather to berries and fruit during the winter. So any of the species like that, cedar waxwings, for example, would be another good example, that are mainly insectivores during the warmer weather, but quickly switch over the fruit and berries once those crops begin to come into sufficient abundance that it'll sustain them. So what stimulates migration? You know, the question was being asked of Teá about how do the caterpillars that are in the ground of the larvae know that it's time to pupate, or how do they come to the surface so they can feed on terrestrial plants and so forth? And the answer in birds is that in many cases, the hormones that regulate migratory behavior are resultant in changes in the hypothalamus, a gland, and this can then increase their hunger, which means they start to eat more, they start to put on body fat, all of which are conditions that indicate that it's time to start migrating. I guess there's probably a lot of us that should start migrating on that strength. At least I put myself in that category. Changes in day length and the position of the sun in the sky are triggers that also alter hormonal changes that again increase their activity budget and the extent to which they're feeding, so that they'll have the energy to make these long migrations in many cases. And similarly, changes in temperature, barometric pressure, and the direction of the wind, you know, from one day to the other, are some of the things that will actually initiate migration on any particular evening. And I say evening because, as we'll see, a great many birds migrate at night, not during the daytime. So these are changes that birds, in the same way that caterpillars and moths are able to pick up changes in temperature, these are things that may affect when they're going to migrate as opposed to whether they're going to migrate. If you're going to be a migrant, there are certain tools of the migration trade that should be part of your kit. One of these is something that you will inherit genetically, and this will be, and I'm being a little anthropomorphic here, it will be a compass and a map, essentially meaning that you have to know what direction you're supposed to go, and then you have to have the tools that will allow you to get there. In other words, you'll have to be able to orient and navigate a course that will get you to wherever your destination is. In some cases, obviously, if you've successfully made your first autumn migration, you'll have the benefit of previous experience to help direct what you're going to do in the following year. You can also take advantage of other individuals, in some cases, parents. So, for example, a lot of waterfowl, like Canada geese, for instance, they travel as family groups. The kids and the adults take a family vacation in their first autumn together. And then they have the benefit of that experience to help get them back home again and to repeat that migration in successive years. And then finally is an ability to read the weather. That comes back to the part about, you know, should we migrate tonight? Should we have migrated yesterday, or should we wait until tomorrow? Because again, these subtle changes in temperature, wind direction, barometric pressure are all factors that birds can detect, they can read, and they can successfully negotiate and navigate if they're going to ultimately be successful as migrants. There's a lot of different types of migration. Some of them are called what we call complete migrations, where all the individuals in a population basically move south. In the case of the least flycatcher, they're going down into the tropics. Partial migration is where some individuals remain in the breeding range but some of them drift south. So birds like blue jays, we have a lot more blue jays here in the winter than we do in the summer. That's because the northern members of the blue jay population, they retreat from Canada and areas where it's really cold and lots of snow for the most part, and take advantage of sunnier climes, but they're not going deep into the tropics. They're going about as far as they have to go to find adequate resources. And sometimes they'll even overfly those that don't have to migrate at all. So in the case of blue jays, for example, a lot of them will winter in the mid-Atlantic states or in the southeast. Eruptive migration is something that doesn't occur every year. So that for those of you who partake of the winter seabird cruises into Boston Harbor, one of the birds that everybody is always hoping to see is the snowy owl. This is an eruptive migrant. It's a bird that doesn't migrate every year, and that migration, along with the migration of birds like the little common redpoll, are determined by food availability in their breeding range, which is a boreal range. And in years when there's a major food failure of one sort or another, in the case of snowy owls, it's lemmings, which are a little Arctic rodent. In the case of redpolls, it's things like catkins from trees like birches. And these trees produce their seeds in varying abundance from year to year, and that determines whether the redpolls stay home or whether they show up at your thistle feeders and black sunflower seed feeders here in New England in the winter. And then there's what's called differential migration, where the genders or age classes may have a different migration. So for example, in herring gulls, we think of herring gulls as year-round here in Boston Harbor and so forth, but in point of fact, the young herring gulls typically move much further south in the winter than do the adults. So come wintertime, if you start looking through groups of herring gulls, you're going to see a lot more adults than you are during the summer. Some of these birds are true champions. The bobolink, a grassland bird species that's well known and beloved by many, is one that is actually one of our longest distance migrating songbirds. And if you look at this map, you can see that the dark brown area represents their breeding range all the way from New England across Canada and the United States up into the northern Great Plains states. The yellow area shows the area through which they migrate, and the blue area way down in Bolivia and Argentina and parts of Peru and Uruguay, these are the areas where bobolinks spend the winter. So for a bird that's about the size of a banana, they make a pretty good trip, and they have to do it twice a year, and they live for multiple years. So that's a long distance migrant and one of the real champions. The partial migrants, like the blue jay on the left, as I described, only part of the population typically migrates in any given year. But then at this time of the year coming up, and especially in late April and May, we see small groups of blue jays migrating during the daytime, headed north, returning to where they will ultimately nest. In the case of the herring gull, differential migrant, this is a young herring gull. These are the guys that if you were to travel down to Florida and the mid-Atlantic coasts of Georgia, South Carolina and all, that's where you'd expect to see a lot more brown herring gulls in the wintertime. The snowy owl on the left and the little redpoll on the right. Again, the snowy owl is driven largely by the abundance of lemmings, and the redpolls are looking for these little birch catkins, which in the northern forests in some winters are very abundant. In other years, they hardly fail. They don't produce many catkins at all. And that's when the redpolls move south out of Canada into the United States to feed. So these are eruptive migrations. This is the kind of thing. So how do these birds find their way? Well, there's a variety of ways. Stars, which again reflects the fact that many species migrate at night. The sun, leading lines, magnetic fields, odors, particularly for a lot of seabirds, they can pick up the smell of land and odors in the currents in the water that are significant to them. And in some cases, they even use man-made structures. For example, superhighways, interstates, it's been demonstrated that in fact, birds have learned to take advantage of the basic trend of whatever direction these things are going. This cartoon speaks volumes, probably for some of you. If you can't see it or appreciate it, it's a flock of sort of generic waterfowl. Well, damn it, I say he should stop and ask someone. Sound familiar? In any case, they don't have that option, but they do take advantage of the stars and are able to use the changing azimuth of the stars at night. They fix on Polaris, the North Star. And there have been studies done experimentally in planetariums where they can really get birds to try to travel in the wrong direction by altering the configuration of the stars at seasons that would be inappropriate for the birds to show increased activity at that time of the year. Leading lines would be things like mountain ranges. The Appalachians are obviously a major leading line. The Atlantic coast and the ocean, these are boundaries and border areas that many birds use as they negotiate their way south and north in both cases. As I suggested, many birds travel at night. And obviously, if you're going to use stars, which is in fact is one of the most important navigation aids that birds use, that's really the only time that it works for them. So in addition to that, there's less predation at night. It does permit this use of the stars. It allows them to forage during the daytime, which they can't in many species. In fact, most species can't do as readily at night. The structure of the atmosphere actually at night is different than it is in the daytime. It provides less impediments to them, and the air is often more stable. So there's a lot of advantages to actually traveling at night. And they don't have any trouble seeing. Again, for species, even day species, diurnal species, they can take advantage of the stars and do what they have to do. This just to sort of demonstrate how impressive migration can be, and one of the ways that it's studied is using radar. This is an image taken off Doppler radar in April, and Key West, Florida is sort of right under that dense green area. And you can see Key Largo and then Miami up sort of in the northeast corner there. Birds show up on radar, as do bats. And people now have determined it's very easy to use radar as a way of tracking migration from night to night, and also in terms of the tendency of the birds to be going in one direction or another. So what's happening here, that cloud, the dense green cloud, is our migrant birds that are coming out of Cuba. You see Havana to the south there. Cuba is a major wintering area for lots of birds, as are the Greater Antilles. But even a lot of South American species eventually are going to use this track and hit the United States, in some cases, literally along the Florida Keys. So that gives you another window to sort of how some of these birds are migrating. Birders, people who are interested in birds out there monitoring and counting and looking at them, and have been doing this for a very long time and seemingly in increasing numbers, can make very valuable contributions as far as understanding where, when, how birds migrate. Mist netting, that's M-I-S-T, is a way of capturing birds that won't harm them so that they can be banded. This is a female rose-breasted grosbeak on the left, and a blue-headed vireo on the right that's getting a little silver band put around one of its legs. In some cases, the birds are receiving colored bands, but in all cases, they're getting a silver Fish and Wildlife Service band that will have a unique number that it will carry for the rest of its life. And if that bird dies somewhere and somebody finds it, or if it's captured again, that tells us a lot about not only longevity, but also the comings and goings of birds and the timing at which they travel and so on. John James Audubon was one of the first that really employed this technique with phoebes. He put colored thread around the legs of phoebes that were nesting near where he was living to see if they'd come back in successive years, and they did. So that right there was an informational data point that going forward has had huge impacts. Nowadays, as technology has increased, there's lots of use of telemetry where satellite transmitters are able to be placed on the birds, and increasingly these are getting smaller and smaller. But this is a guy named Rob Beauregard who's been studying osprey migration for a number of years. And what you can see here, he's done a lot of his banding here in New England, in fact, on Martha's Vineyard. And you can see if you look at these colored lines that head down through Cuba and then over the island of Hispaniola and ultimately into northern South America. That gives you some idea of how far ospreys migrate. And with this kind of telemetry, it's possible in real time to get a sense of what my birds are doing. This is showing fall migration, but at the same time, these transmitters can be adjusted so that you can track them in the spring so that we can tell as they start coming back to New England. How high do they fly? Well, there again, there's some metrics here. Most migrants are traveling under 3,000 feet. Songbirds tend not to travel anywhere nearly as high as a lot of the water birds. Some shorebirds, however, that would be things like sandpipers and plovers, can regularly travel as much as 15 to 20,000 feet when they're flying over the ocean, which many of them do on their way from Arctic Canada to areas in South America. And on the other side of the world, bar-headed geese and certain species of vultures in Asia regularly travel over 25,000 feet. So that in the Himalayas, these bar-headed geese are regularly seen the same way we would see Canada geese migrating here. It's an extraordinary thing when you think about the oxygen debt and the difference in the atmospheric conditions and so on. It's really quite amazing that these birds can do what they can do and the speed with which they can do it. A bird like the little house finch here tends to fly a lot slower and a lot lower. But again, given its size and where it goes, that's not surprising. The bar-headed geese have a long migration. The house finch doesn't move anywhere nearly as far. How fast they travel, again, this is variable. Somewhere between 20 and 50 miles an hour is sort of standard issue. But if you bring it down to the size of birds like sparrows and finches and things, most of them, it's somewhere in the sort of 18 to 30 miles per hour. And the weather and wind can influence their flight speeds. If they have the benefit of a tailwind, that's a good thing. And if they don't, that slows them down, or they may simply stall their migration, wait a couple of days until the weather changes in their favor. So that at this time of the year, and as we approach spring and the peak migration season of May, southwest winds generally are the conditions, along with the rising temperature. That combination of factors are the things that really influence when we see the greatest migratory flights in the morning, or if you're out there with radar or listening to the chips and lisps that the migrants make when they're migrating, that's another indication of what's going on. But without transmitters, some of these figures here are a little hard to figure based on what we know about migration. They don't all follow the same route. I'm going to show you three different warblers here: blackpoll, bay-breasted warbler, and Cape May warbler. And if we look at a map, you can sort of see that there are these arrows, these colored arrows coming and going from different directions. Some birds, like the Cape May warbler, typically uses a fairly conservative route down through from eastern Canada, northern New England, down into the greater Antilles, where it spends the winter, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Cuba, and Peninsula Florida is really important to the Cape May warbler. If we look at the purple swath right through the middle of the country, that's the bay-breasted warbler. They're more aggressive migrants. They make a trans-Gulf of Mexico flight, which is not right around the corner. You know, they have to make, several hundred miles, 600 miles or more nonstop in order to do some of what they do. And others will go around the Gulf down through Mexico. And then if we look at the blackpoll warbler, this is one whose migration in spring and fall is a little different. The blackpolls in the fall have this super aggressive migration where they go all the way from New England over the Atlantic Ocean, out over Bermuda and into South America. In the spring, however, most of the blackpolls take a more conservative route. They don't have to fly into the wind over the ocean, but they go up through Florida. And then as they begin to get further north, they fan out and they breed all the way from Alaska to Labrador and Newfoundland. So just some examples of warblers alone and how much variation there is in what just those three little birds can do. The superstar marathoners, however, are some of the seabirds like the Arctic tern and the little Wilson storm petrel. The Arctic tern breeds inside the Arctic Circle in many areas, and it winters in Antarctica. The Wilson storm petrel breeds in Antarctica and then spends its summer at sea off of places like Cape Cod and northern New England. So that these guys are going huge distances, trans-hemispheric, based on where they breed and where they're going to spend the winter. But seabirds are kind of a different story in that they have different requirements than a lot of the land birds. But I think this serves to illustrate just how spectacular some of these migrations are. Just one sort of final example here. This is a sandpiper, a big shorebird called the Hudsonian godwit. This is a bird that breeds largely west of Hudson Bay in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Canada, and spends the winter in southern South America. This particular individual with these colored bands on it, green, red, and you can't see the silver band under the green band, but this is an individual that's been photographed twice on Cape Cod, and we know from the color bands this bird was banded on its wintering areas in Chile, on Chiloé Island, which is off the west coast of Chile. And yet they come down and cross the ocean like the blackpoll warbler in the fall to reach South America. Then they cross over South America, and in the spring they go up through the central part of the Great Plains, Texas, and back up into their Canadian breeding grounds. So we're talking a lot of serious travel at this time of the year, which is not without hazards. And you know, some of the things that Teá was describing for moths are factors for bird migrants as well. Tall lighted structures, glass, food shortages on when they're traveling, predators, storms, and sometimes they just plain make a mistake. There's navigational error involved in any organisms that's doing the kind of traveling that these things do. There were some epic and historic kills of birds flying into lighthouses at one time, and they figured out ways that they can minimize this kind of mortality. But this sort of thing that we see in cities is still a huge area, still a huge source of mortality. And increasingly there are efforts being made to turn out the highest levels of lights in the skyscrapers. Some cases they're using different colored lights, or they're using the timing seasonally to minimize the extent to which migratory birds can get confused under certain conditions, particularly low overcast, foggy weather, light rain that may overtake them during the night. Peregrine falcon, which is a major long distance migrant itself, but they take large numbers of migratory birds. They're the fastest flying bird in the world in terms of their diving ability when they're stooping on prey at close to 200 miles an hour. So not much can stand between them and mortality if a peregrine sets its sight on them. But that's one of the things, they don't feed at night. So that's why, another reason why a lot of them don't migrate at night. And then I kind of finish up here with this morbid picture. This is a kitty cat. And it turns out that cats may in fact be one of the primary sources of mortality for songbirds in the United States. So if you have a cat, please keep it indoors. They make out better for a variety of reasons for their own health, but they certainly will reduce and minimize the amount of mortality that they take on small birds. So with that, I would urge you to take advantage of the coming warm weather, which hopefully we're going to get starting tomorrow, unless April Fool's Day turns out to be a typical April Fool's Day. But by May, and from about the second week of April on, there's going to be huge numbers of birds migrating, and lots of different ways that you can intercept their migration. And in some cases, a lot of them will stop temporarily, especially the ones that are headed further north on places like the Harbor Islands, or they'll be moving overhead, and you'll have a chance to see them and take advantage of the seasonality. So I thank you for attending, and I hope between the all the information you learned about moths, you've got a sense of some good stuff.
Thank you so much, Wayne. That was amazing. I feel like I learned something new every day, and I love presentations like this. You can keep your Yep, you can keep your video on if you want. You just turned it off. So you can keep your video on, and we are going to have some questions now. Again, feel free to drop your questions into the chat, the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window. So the first question, first of all, there's a lot of thank yous coming in. So everyone, I think, really enjoyed this presentation. So there's one question that we have is an inquiry about the goshawk. And they have seen it as far south as Pennsylvania, but only every couple of years. Do you know, can you speak a little bit about the goshawk and what the migratory pattern might be for that?
Yeah, the goshawk is essentially an eruptive species. That is to say, first of all, they're not that common in much of the eastern United States generally. They're more common in the West and the Rocky Mountains and so on, but they are more like, I liken them to the snowy owl. And because they're not that common, their eruptions are not as conspicuous as they are in something like the snowy owl, because they're a forest bird. They feed mostly on grouse, and in the Arctic and subarctic boreal forests where they live, they feed on snowshoe hares. They're a very powerful bird. And even in areas where they may be nesting nearby, unless people happen to transgress and get into their territory, they might not even know that the goshawks were around. They don't spend a lot of time soaring up in the sky like red-tailed hawks and some of the other more conspicuous and common species. But if you get near a goshawk nest, if you're lucky enough to find a goshawk nest, you better wear a hard hat, or better yet, stay away from them and don't disturb them.
Definitely. Thanks so much. One person asked, they've said that they've seen maps showing that some birds use a different path when they're traveling north versus traveling south in their migratory travels. Why might they be using different routes? Is it weather, wind, food supplies, etc.? Yes,
it's all of those things. Food supply is certainly one of the things. For example, if the Hudsonian godwit that I showed you near the end there, which is a really super long distance migrant, makes an overwater migrant that's similar to what I showed when I described the blackpoll warbler. They're flying nonstop from James Bay in Canada all the way to South America on one hop. And in point of fact, they are taking advantage of the trade winds and so forth that will be to their advantage going in that direction. In the spring, that would not be at all conducive to what they're trying to do. At the same time, in the spring, in the prairie states where they come out of South America going north on a completely different route, their migration looks like a parenthesis. The fall, it's the offshore route. In the spring, they're taking advantage of insects and a lot of the things that they can get in freshwater areas in the central part of the country or along the Gulf Coast before they head back up into Arctic Canada to breed. Some of our warblers do the same thing. The blackpoll, which has a migration that in many ways is similar to the godwit, you know, they're tiny little things, and you can mail one in an envelope for the cost of a postage stamp practically to California. So in the fall, they're able to take advantage of tailwinds, even though they're out over the ocean. But in the spring, those winds would not be favorable to them, and there's no way they could possibly make it. So in the spring, they go up through Florida and up through the eastern United States before they fan out. But they don't take the offshore route in the spring. So it is a combination of food availability, you know, what they're looking for food, whether it's available in the spring and the fall, but also it has to do with weather and meteorological advantages or disadvantages as of doing it one way or the other.
Great, thank you so much for that. A couple more questions. I know we're running short on time, but we have some really great questions that came in. So someone said you mentioned that young birds need a compass and map to learn to migrate to the proper destination. Why does a Western, I'm going to mispronounce this bird name, why does a Western tanager migrate to Plymouth, Mass in the fall, and will that same bird and others who make similar mistakes return to that same mistaken destination the following years?
Well, there's two parts to the answer and the question. First of all, one of the things that explains why the Western tanager showed up in southeastern Massachusetts one of the bullets that I had there talked about, they make a mistake. They get into trouble, navigational error. That's one possibility. The other is also that the map and the compass that they inherited, it's a genetic misfire. They're given the wrong information. You know, it's simple as that. In other words, I won't say it's a mutation exactly, but it is not the norm. And that's when they end up going the wrong directions. There's a lot of interest in the bird watching community as well as the research community in vagrancy. Teá was talking about vagrant moths, things from the south that end up, you know, in New England or in Boston, it sort of spuriously and not by design. The same thing can happen with birds. And again, there's multiple reasons for it. But the bottom line is the second part of the question, if they successfully accomplish an inappropriate migration, and if in fact they then are able to return to where they started from, they will very typically repeat that migration. In other words, migration on a broader front is where a bird, it becomes polarized on a wintering area and a breeding area. You know, when it first gets its start, that's home base, and it will try to return generally to that same area every year. If it happens that the wintering area that it's chosen or that it's ended up in is not appropriate, if it was at least successful enough to get them through the winter, they will then very often, especially in long-lived birds, they will make their way back to wherever they started from, and then the successive winter, they'll be back. And there's lots of cases of vagrant birds that are recognizable because they're vagrants, they're way out of range, that have repeated in many cases for many years in succession. Maybe they're coming to a bird feeder, maybe if they're a water bird, maybe they'll frequent a certain stretch of beach or something like that. But so that's kind of what's going on there.
So migrations can kind of change depending on if one bird made a mistake, then maybe their offspring will end up going to that new place moving forward.
Well, that's an interesting variation on what the original question was, but to a certain extent, that's true. For example, there are a couple of Arctic nesting geese, birds that breed in Iceland and Greenland, that were for many years basically unknown in North America. And then a few outliers began to end up here. And what those outliers probably did was to follow species that regularly are making that migration. And then when they went back to, let's say, Greenland or Iceland, they ultimately, because they're long-lived species, they started breeding. And because of what I said earlier, geese travel as families. So the kids will follow the adults. So if you get adults that made a mistake but survived and are now repeating it, if they are back home, they're going to bring the kids with them. And that's why some of these bird species are colonizing new areas in the New World, coming from European areas. And then there are cases of birds here in North America whose ranges are changing, in some cases possibly due to periodic or maybe successive navigational mistakes. And they're doing the same thing, making the same mistakes, but they're able to survive, and their population is now beginning to increase in areas that historically they never occurred.
Awesome, thank you so much. So it's very interesting, very exciting.
Good stuff.
So yeah, it's great stuff. So it is 8:24, and there are a couple other questions, but if you don't mind, I think we might email them to you afterwards to see if you might have a minute to respond to them after the fact if we can. But I do want to be cognizant of everybody's time. So we're going to wrap up here. I just want to thank you, Wayne and Teá, so much for these wonderful presentations. I know I learned a lot. I hope that everybody else did too. And thank you to our audience for attending this evening. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second part of a three-part series on Revolutionary Harbor. So our third and final Revolutionary Harbor lecture, introducing you to the brand new Stone Living Lab, will be on Wednesday, April 21st at the same time, 7 p.m. The link is or will shortly be in the chat. So if you would like to register for the next event. Another really exciting upcoming event I want to mention is the City Nature Challenge, which starts in 1 month on April 30th. The City Nature Challenge is a way for anyone and everyone to get involved with documenting nature in their own city or their own backyard. You can even take observations of the species that we learned about today. You can go to the Boston Area City Nature Challenge landing page to learn more. You can join the project on iNaturalist and learn how to use iNaturalist using the links in the chat as well. Keep an eye on the park social media and web pages to learn more in the coming months. I would now like to pass it over to Rebecca Smerling, Director of Programs at Boston Harbor Now, for some closing remarks.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much to our speakers this evening. Boston Harbor Now is so grateful to our partners at the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, and in particular, the Natural Resource Team of the National Park Service for collaborating on another successful virtual program. We couldn't do it without you, them, or without the support of you, our audience. We hope to see you at one of the many parks along the Harbor Walk or on the Harbor Islands in just 52 short days when the ferries will start running. So we'll see you there. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.